Well, for more on the beverage industry, let's bring in Richard Blau. Richard is the shareholder and chair of the Alcohol, Beverage and Food Department at the Gray Robinson Law Firm. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
So tell us about some of the more significant deals that we're now seeing in the beverage industry.
I think you're seeing a reaction to the reality of globalization and the development of a stronger economy, not just in the United States, but across the globe. Companies that had historically relied on a principal brand or a handful of small iconic brands are now realizing that to compete globally, they have to purchase and acquire additional iconic brands that have marketability across the world.
Now, you also have changing consumer tastes. So how are some of these beverage firms adapting? You have calls for less sugar in some drinks, less sodas, some of these natural brands, and even some of these local and small startups entering the market. How are they adapting?
Well, I don't think that companies who currently possess iconic brands are going to readily give them up. But what they may wind up doing is diversifying. Your report earlier mentioned the fact that PepsiCo's Pepsi-Cola brand revenues dropped, but they were offset by increase in snack food, which are brands that are also owned by PepsiCo. That kind of diversification, I think, will become the trend rather than the exception as we move forward.
Now, let's also look around the world in terms of what you're seeing with global trends in the sorts of drinks that are really gaining and losing popularity.
Yeah, I think that your earlier report was correct, that soft drinks with high sugar content are becoming less popular, especially among younger consumers that are becoming more aware of health effects and looking for products that bring more quality and more value to their lives. But again, diversification is key. These markets will be serviced by companies that accrue a number of different iconic brands that diversify their portfolios and allow them to appeal to a wide variety or a larger spectrum of consumers.
And as we look across the industry, comparing the non-alcoholic drinks versus the alcohol brands, how do they stack up against each other in terms of deal activity and profitability?
Well, that's a great question because I think the alcohol industry is very telling of this kind of diversification that I'm talking about. If you look at some of the major players in the North American market, historically, they were always focused on their iconic alcohol beverages. Anheuser-Busch, the Miller Brewing Company, Jim Beam, and yet look where they are now. Miller was acquired by and became SAB Miller, a South African corporation that acquired them. Anheuser-Busch, which has for over a century been a U.S. domestic company based in St. Louis, is now Anheuser-Busch InBev, with a global footprint and an ever-expanding portfolio. Suntory now owns the iconic Jim Beam and Maker's Mark brands. These are all trends that indicate a recognition that in order to survive in a globalized economy, these companies have to diversify and look to markets beyond their historical backyard.
And what are some other challenges that the beverage industry is facing at the moment?
Well, as your reporting has noted, the younger generation of consumers that are now coming into their buying power prime are really focused on products that bring quality to the table, that have a concern for health and are made in a manner that younger consumers feel exude confidence and quality. That's going to be a trend that I think continues over time.
Now, let's also look at climate change. How much of a concern is that for beverage firms, especially given some of the issues that we see with these crops and these extreme weather events?
Well, the climate change is a concern across the board. It isn't just the food and beverage industry. Some of the leading politicians, policy advocates, major leaders of major think tanks all recognize that market shifts in climate can lead to instability, which leads to insecurity, which leads not only to strategic issues like food and the unavailability of adequate resources for growing and producing and distributing food, but also the resulting consequences of instability or destabilizing events that can really turn a nation state or a community upside down.
All right, well, thank you so much for your insights. Richard Blau there of the Gray Robinson Law Firm.